banks and stable coins are kind of like a Trojan horse for Bitcoin. And we kind of put together a much more practical thesis on what does that actually look like? How would that actually even happen in the first place? Um, so I think that, we spent the majority of the year kind of focused on that. We wrote this report with the former chief technology officer of Silvergate, and they built this technology network in the US called the SEN network, which is what all of the cryptocurrency exchanges were using to settle dollar liquidity amongst one another, basically until the whole industry blew up effectively. And it was Operation Choke Point 2.0 that kind of took Silvergate out back, and Biden administration basically took him out back and shot him. And they had a voluntary wind down. They didn't go bankrupt or anything, but they're just like, we can't operate in this type of an environment anymore. And now that regulations change, it's like businesses can, banks can. And yeah, so it's a really interesting question to us, because we think it could be like one of the new vectors of adoption for Bitcoin over time. And it's ultimately something that's getting this whole new world that manages the most money in the world exposure into Bitcoin over time, because there's money to be made. Once you understand the value of Bitcoin, once you understand it well, then you understand that it's not nearly as risky as you once perceived it. And then all of a sudden, as a bank, you say, wow, this is a really valuable form of collateral. How can I make loans on this collateral? Oh, these loans are 10%, 12% interest right now. Okay, so I kind of understand Bitcoin now. I realize it's not nearly as risky as what the way people thought it was, and I'm going to structure my loans to work around its volatility, and I can get a really high interest rate off of getting into this form of lending. And we see that as kind of like the lowest hanging fruit market that banks will be moving into, and then they're going to realize the benefits of using things like Bitcoin and stable coins to do cross-border payments as well on behalf of their clients, and that's a whole vector of revenue that's also going to be proliferating. I think that, like, when it comes to these uh the whole like thesis around what is going to make a bank different from everything else, and going back to the bank charter point, a bank charter just is your license to take depositor money and lend it. And like, that is the cheapest form of capital in the world effectively. So like, that's what banks have as a competitive advantage. Whether or not you agree with that is a separate question, but nonetheless, um, if you don't have a bank charter, it's going to be very hard for you to compete in these businesses over time. There's going to be markets that exist for it, but banks are going to start dominating these markets over time, because it's really hard to compete against free money. All we're really doing is trading around the debt of the government. That's what we're doing when we're trading around dollars. And all we need is a layer that really makes it fungible. And what I mean by that is, the reason, like, when you think about that question, it's like, okay, well, treasury securities, they pay some sort of rate of return. Why wouldn't I just like have treasury securities earn interest and then pay people with treasury securities? And the main reason is because they're not fungible. So one treasury security is often very different from another one. It was issued at a different date. It has a different maturity. It has a different interest rate. Has all these different differences in the terms of it. So what is stablecoins effectively doing? It's blending all those securities across to make them like for like, to make them more fungible in a stablecoin pegged to the dollar. So that's why you kind of still need that layer, and why you're not trading it directly. But the really interesting thing is that stablecoins are going to be paying a rate of interest, at least internationally. And to understand the key dynamic here, you have to understand what happened with the Genius Act when it got passed back in August this year. And it did two primary things. The first thing being, it said banks or stablecoin providers are only allowed to use short duration government debt in their reserves. And that was big, because there's a lot of things that stablecoin providers have been using. They've been using short duration government debt, longer duration commercial paper, and Bitcoin. So keep that in mind. That's the first one. And then the second one is that they didn't allow stablecoin providers to pay a rate of interest. So that meant that unless you have a bank charter and you're issuing a stablecoin in the US, you cannot pay interest from your stablecoin to anybody that's holding it. Well, all that is regulatory ring fencing so that banks aren't outcompeted, to the point I was making earlier. They're trying to say like, okay, well, only banks can do this because of this law. And that still allows banks to have some sort of competitive advantage over stablecoin providers. They create two different versions of Tether, one that's US compliant and then one that's compliant in the way that they've been operating historically. And what we witnessed within the past few weeks is that they've launched a US compliant stablecoin now, USAT. And that's something that's abiding by the Genius Act regulations. So what's happened now that they've done that is they've created effectively an onshore and an offshore market for stablecoins. And that's where we see a lot of similar to how money, what's always happened with the dollar. We've had onshore and offshore market versions of it with, like, the euro dollar system, things that are kind of outside the control of the US compliance and regulation and systems, but yet still exist and represent dollar denominated value in the international markets. We kind of view Tether as becoming like this offshore version of the dollar. And what we expect is that, everything's going to be compliant within the US, but in the offshore market, we're going to start to see that all these stable coins are competing based on paying a rate of interest to people. That's what we're going to start witnessing, is that while the US might say only banks can do that and the banks can compete on that, and that's going to be, not great for stable coins out here, and it's going to put the US behind on innovation. In the offshore market, they're going to start paying a rate of interest. And when we start to see that competition among stable coins paying a rate of interest, it creates a really interesting question. What is the best reserve I can be holding to optimize, my dollar peg, as well as to pay the most competitive rate of interest onto, the people that are trading my token? And that's where the question of Bitcoin gets really interesting in this whole conversation. As Tether has been holding 5% reserves in Bitcoin, how will that expand over time? And when we think about it, what is that best reserve that's going to allow the most competitive rate of interest? And then that brings up this question of, well, what happened with Michael Saylor when he issued this stretch preferred equity product this year? And we're effectively creating something that's mimicking and competing in the market of like short duration debt, and it's paying a 9% interest rate. And he's fully collateralizing that with just a Bitcoin backing effectively, or not reserving necessarily directly, but he's paying the interest based on, the expectation of Bitcoin's capital appreciation. So we view Stretch as kind of like the proto version of where the stablecoin market is going to start going over time. Like, the Stretch product is cool, it's just not in the right rails. You buy it as a stock in your brokerage account. The difference between you paying for something with a bank account versus you paying for something with a stablecoin is really meaningful when it comes to Bitcoin adoption, because the step from paying for something with a stablecoin cryptographic signature to Bitcoin, that's the flip of a switch. The step from paying for something with a bank account to Bitcoin, well, you got to get out of the bank account, you got to get onto the new rails, and it creates all this friction for people to actually switch over. So it's a great next step to get people on the right rails. And then as people realize or don't realize and just naturally gravitate towards, because they trust other people that are doing it, that Bitcoin is the best form of money and it's better than dollar denominated assets, people will just naturally start paying for things in Bitcoin. So the way that we view it is there's like three primary cycles of Bitcoin adoption. And we view those cycles to be aligned with its adoption for different functions of money, each kind of building on top of one another. So when we think about how money has just been adopted historically, it's not that everybody wakes up one day and says, I'm going to use this form of money now. When money was adopted in private markets, it's something that would naturally progress through different stages and eventually become something that everybody was using as money. And stage number one is it a good store of value? Because without being a good store of value, it's hard for everybody to want to own it in the first place. And that's like a really key ingredient. I think when a lot of people criticize Bitcoin, who are like traditional economists, will say, well, most of the other goods that were used in primitive times, they had some sort of utility. And because they had some sort of consumption utility, a lot of people own them. So in like agricultural societies, when people owned cattle and people owned salt, these were just very common goods that everybody was using all the time. And then they ended up using those two goods as money because everybody had them. Everybody always had a demand for them. And that's kind of the argument against Bitcoin. And what we argue for is that, well, no, it's kind of two factors. What makes people want to own something? And it's kind of two factors that makes people want to own something. It's either its consumption value, which is what we're describing with cattle and salt. People wanted to eat it. People wanted to put salt on the meat. Or it's the monetary value being a good store value. And a lot of people would just own assets because they were just scarce assets. And that's how we saw precious metals get adopted, like gold and silver, is that they were the scarcest commodities in the world at that time. And that made them something everybody wanted to own because we knew the supply of them wouldn't drastically increase. And so that's something that allows money to slowly become something that everybody owns. And that's the phase that we're in with Bitcoin right now, is we're consuming the market of the store value. And that means we're getting everybody to own some Bitcoin. And the second everybody owns Bitcoin, that's when, or at least the vast majority of people, that's when things start to get really easy when it comes to thinking about it as a medium of exchange. Because one, at that point, so many people are going to own it that the volatility has decreased so much. And two, everybody's going to be familiar with it. Everybody's going to know how to transact in it because they own it in some way, shape, or form. And that greases the wheels and reduces all the friction to using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. So like we're in this S-curve market right now trying to capture this whole store value market. We view that as a longest adoption cycle. The second that happens, the other two cycles will be more rapid. And then that means it's going to be used as a medium of exchange. And people all just start saying, okay, well, all of us own Bitcoin. Bitcoin's kind of how we're saving our money now. And I just pay me in Bitcoin because I want more of that, because this is like my savings payment basically. And pretty much everybody I know also accepts it. So it's really easy for me to just like pay for something else in Bitcoin.
Thank you for watching this video. This was only a snippet of the podcast. And if you want to watch the full episode and get all of the context of this episode, you can click right here or here. Oh, maybe also here.